Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Into the Wild with Lawren Harris. This is the third part in Wendy's Into the Wild series, and the third and final part, and we thank you for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to Wendy in just a moment. First, a little bit of an introduction and a couple of technical tips for today's webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Melanie Blake, and I'm the Director of Classical Pursuits. I'm here today with Samantha Clark, a marketing manager at Worldwide Quest, and of course with Wendy O'Brien, a philosopher, a nature lover, a longtime Classical Pursuits and Worldwide Quest trip leader, and she'll be taking you north and more north in just a moment. Thanks everyone who signed up for the original date of the webinar. As you know, we're doing it on a little bit of a different date today, on a Wednesday. So we're wrapping up this series, and then we do have another webinar tomorrow exploring the everyday beauty, the arts of Japan with Sean Forrester. So that's our normal Thursday webinar. If you haven't signed up for that, please go ahead. And again, it's free and open to all. And then we also have a little bit of a schedule shift in a couple weeks for Remembrance Day. We have a very special Remembrance Day webinar with scholar Bruce Meyer. He'll be talking about Canadian literature of World War I, and especially several poets whose work was really suppressed or ignored or forgotten in the period after the war. And he's brought a lot of those works and these soldiers' stories to light. So please do join us on November 11th for our Remembrance Day webinar. Wendy and I will be back next week. We are talking about women in the Parisian cafe. We are back by popular request following my initial webinar on the role of cafes in Paris and in France. So this time we're going to be focusing on ladies in the cafe, and we're really excited about it. As usual, we have a whole other range of programs for you, webinars, seminars, small group seminars, our trips. I know Wendy's going to be talking a little bit more about that. For any questions, please feel free to contact me or contact Samantha or anyone at Worldwide Quest. And also look in your inboxes tomorrow for a special ghost-themed newsletter from Classical Pursuits celebrating Halloween and this ghosty time. That's it from me. Samantha and I will be here to answer any questions you have. You can type them in the questions box that you see in your control panel. It'll either say questions or maybe have a little bit of question mark. And just a quick note, everybody is in listen-only mode, but you can contact us or communicate with us through that question box. And we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of Wendy's session. Thanks again, everyone, and Wendy, over to you.
Thanks, Melanie, and thank you, Samantha, for giving me this opportunity. So over the past few weeks, I've been thinking about, and hopefully we've been thinking about, what draws us into the wild? You know, what is it that leads us to places that look like this? You know, what led, for example, Audubon into wild places in the world as he searched out, you know,
Wendy, may I interrupt you for a second? I can't see your webcam.
Uh-oh. I'm not sure. Sorry, everybody. We're just going to try to figure this out. Samantha, can you?
Yeah, I sent you a prompt to share it. There you are. Thank you.
Oops. There we are. There are times when, you know, there are technical elements, even as you're thinking about the wild. Maybe something we can talk about a little bit later. Yeah, I was interested in what drew Audubon to wild places in the world as he tracked down his amazing collections of birds and documented them. And then, you know, what draws us to the wild in our dreams and in our imagination when we can't be there in person. Last week, if you were with me, we talked about Henri Rousseau and his amazing painting, the dream that we see here. And we thought a little bit about the wild, not just in the world, but the wild in our minds. And today, what I'd like us to have some time to reflect on it, and I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on this. We do have a chat function on the side, and if you have some ideas, like I said, I'd be very eager to hear what you think. You know, what is us that draws us to these places and spaces? What is it that, you know, leads us to heed the call of the wild, as it were? What captivates us so? You know, what do we hope to find in wild places and wild spaces? And thinking about this question, I couldn't help but think of a better artist, a better companion to have us think about, you know, what draws us to wild places? What do we hope that we're going to find there? Then this artist, then guy at the front here leading the way. This is the Canadian artist, Lawren Harris. Now, if you were with me when we did our nature walk tour, you might have heard me mention Harris. When we talked about Tom Thompson's work, I mentioned the fact that Thompson worked alongside, but wasn't really part of this group of artists. This is the group of 7. Now, the group of 7 were a group of artists who found themselves in Toronto, mostly working in the advertising industry at the turn of the century. And, well, they're united not so much by any particular style of art, but they were united by an idea that captivated the nation, continues to captivate us today, that came to really define Canadian landscape art. Now, the group of 7 was composed of J.E.H. MacDonald, Arthur Lismer, V.H. Varley, Frank Carmichael, Frank Johnston, A.Y. Jackson, and Emily Carr wasn't officially one of the members, but she's often associated with them because she shared a lot of the same principles or ideas about art and about landscape. Now, leading this group and perhaps encapsulating the ideals of it better than anybody else was Lawren Harris. Okay, I have to tell you, he was the unofficial leader of the group and also its greatest cheerleader in many ways. He was a real advocate of the basic ideas or principles that underlie the group's work. Now, in order to understand what those were and to place them in a better context, important to keep in mind that as we entered into the 20th century, it was really considered Canada-centric. There was this incredible optimism about what Canada was going to be and what its future was going to be like. There was so much belief that, well, here you can see in this beautiful kind of collage, there was this idea that the Canadian West was opening up, there was going to be opportunities galore, there was going to be chances for immigrants to come, to have land, to have a better life. There was the idea of the opening up of the country and of this incredible prosperity that would belong to us. And it would belong to us very much on our own terms. It would be Canada for Canada's sake. It would be our own kind of government, our own, well, for us this afternoon, our own kind of art. And that's where really the group of 7 come in. Their kind of optimism and enthusiasm for the nation extended into the call for the creation of a Canadian art. Probably the best way to understand this is to look at what Harris had to say in the quote that you find on the screen in front of you right now. He said, "Through our own creative experience, we, the group, came to know the real tradition in art isn't housed only in museums and art galleries and in great works of art. It is innate in us and can be galvanized into activity by the power of creative endeavor in our own day and in our own country by our own creative individuals in the arts. We also came to realize that we in Canada cannot truly understand great cultures of the past and other people until we ourselves commence on our own creative life in the art. Until we do so, we are looking at these from the outside. So just a little bit of background for this call for Canadian art. If you were an artist in Canada pre the turn of the century, what probably would have happened is you would have studied the great European masters, and in all likelihood, if you were talented, and indeed many of the group of seven and also Emily Carr would go to Europe, and that's where you would learn, and that's where you would practice. And when you came back, oftentimes the images that you were expected to create weren't of this place and of this time, but were of elsewhere and otherwise. And I think that this call for Canadian art that really was the heart of the group of seven. They were very different in terms of their styles. You probably noticed as I flipped through their names with examples of their work, different in styles, different in their palettes, different in their level of abstraction. But what joined them together was the real belief that we needed to have an art from this place and for this time. Now, some of you might be familiar with the critic Ruskin, and he had a lot to say about this. He wrote at one point in time, it wasn't until a nation had not only its own laws and its own literature, but its own art, that it actually became a nation unto itself. I think that idea really took hold with the group of seven. They were so committed to creating an art, as I mentioned, for this place and for this time and of this country. And to do that, well, they headed off on what Harris described as the great adventure. What they did was, well, they had to outdoors and literally into the country that we live in. This is a photograph that's taken of Varley here and Tom Thompson. You have a number of the group of seven here on a trip that they took to Algonquin. What they would do is they would, well, head out into the wild and paint on plein air, sometimes making small kind of sketches or small works on backs of pieces of old wood that they would find, that they would then take to their studio in Toronto and transform into larger works, more finished works. Yeah, they would head out into the wild. They felt that call. They heeded that call. For, as Harris noted, he said that experiences, much more than instruction, are a seeing with the inner eye, finding a channel to our essential inner life, a door to our deepest understanding, wherein we have the capacity for universal response. He was going to go out into the world. They were going to experience the wild, but always understanding that the farther out you go, the farther in you could go as well. And I think we'll see some of that reflected in his paintings and in his project as we're going on this afternoon. What they ended up doing was creating this remarkable collection of images of the Canadian landscape, where they tried to capture the power and clarity and rugged elemental beauty of our own land. Now, Harris really was, as I mentioned, the cheerleader for this project. He was by far the most gregarious of the group, and he not only wrote a number of articles about their project and about this idea of Canadian art, but he also would go to lots of places and events. He would do a number of kind of promotional opportunities. But I think that it wasn't for him just that he wanted to sell the work. I think he really did believe that there was something in the landscape that needed to be transformed, transposed perhaps, onto the canvas. I do believe that he thought that there was something unique about each place and each time that he wanted to well, sitting where we are today, to get us to continue to think about. Maybe, and I have to say, I'm thinking this as we're going through, I often wonder if he didn't write so much about their project and give us so many examples of what he was doing because he wanted us to do the same. to kind of use the model that the group of 7 developed to look at, well, the landscapes on the outside and the landscapes on the inside that we experience on our own and by ourselves in our country, in our countries today. Well, he began this call to create a Canadian art, really quite close to home. He began, and a lot of people don't know this, by actually painting his own neighborhood. He was, as I mentioned earlier, all the group of 7 were located in Toronto. And he started by literally painting the streets that he walked on, the streets that he lived in, the streets that he knew oh so well, including, well, not just the streets where the wealthy and the famous live, not just the austere streets, but also he spent a lot of time creating images like this one. Now, this painting called The Ward 1917 was of a neighborhood called The Ward. Here it is. It's a photograph of the neighborhood. When people look at this, they would be, many of you may or may not know, that the neighborhood that we're looking at, this particular region in Toronto, is now the heart of the city. This is the area where we now find our new city hall, where we find the Eaton Centre. The ward was, well, it was probably as close to a slum as Toronto has ever had. What had happened was there was a need for a place when new immigrants came to Canada, when they came to Ontario, to Toronto especially, for them to find kind of low income housing. And this is where they would oftentimes end up. And the ward, well, during its existence, was, well, a collection of many languages, of many religions. It gave people a place to start with. But as you can see from these photographs, it was, well, when you think about it, as I mentioned now, what a huge change from Toronto then to Toronto now. Now, eventually, the ward would be bulldozed to make way for those new buildings. But during the time, it was such an important neighborhood. Not only did Harris do paintings of the buildings of these streets in the ward, but also Varley would do some portraits of the people who were living in this neighborhood. Now, when the ward was flattened, some people, if you know a little bit about Toronto, you know, we have Chinatown and Little Italy and Little Portugal. Really, that was when those kind of pocket ethnic neighborhoods really developed in Toronto, as people who lived once all together here migrated to finding others who spoke the same language and shared some of the same culture. Yeah, this neighborhood, well, this neighborhood kind of preoccupied Harris for a period of time. And I just thought it was so interesting, right? Looking at this photograph from the ward and his painting of it and what he was doing and his ability to capture, I think, not only what this place looked like on the outside, but also some of what it felt like on the inside to walk down these places and spaces. So he spent time. He started out his career, as I mentioned, painting the city that he lived in and this neighborhood in particular, and painting it not just in bright weather, but it's one of my favorites, and I couldn't resist showing it, but also in the winter. But painting these images of downtown Toronto, painting these images of what was at one time Toronto the Good, there was something that he wasn't getting from it. There was something that he was looking for, something that he was seeking that he couldn't find there. And with that recognition, with his acknowledgement of it, well, he started out on a new project. He realized that he couldn't paint the streets that he knew. Instead, for him to make art, to make really great art, well, look at the quote here from him. He said, "Art has to take to the road and risk all for the glory of adventure." And that's what he did, and that's where he headed off to. And what really captivated him was the idea of the North. something about going north, that he thought that there was a better chance to find this something that was calling to him, this something that was preoccupying him. When it came to the idea of the North, and which will lead him to the Arctic in Canada, he said he said, the source of our art is not in the achievement of other artists in other places and lands, although it's learned a great deal from that. Our art is founded on a long and growing love and understanding of the North in an ever clearer experience of oneness with the informing spirit of the whole land and a strange brooding sense of Mother Nature, fostering a new race and a new age. So the Canadian artist was drawn north. Leaving the city, he had to go north to capture this thing, to get a feel for this thing that called him not to the urban spaces, but to wild and wilder places. And I want to pause for a moment because I did ask this question at the beginning as I was getting started, and I am really intrigued to know what calls you to wild places and wild spaces. What draws you out of the city, out of your house, and into nature trails or into the wild? You can't do it now as we stay safe. You can't do it now by traveling. What draws us to these images and these pictures, to the literature of the wild, even when we can't travel there? If you've got some ideas about that, I mentioned before, I'd be really intrigued to hear what you think it is. And you can use the chat function on the screen in front of you to offer up some of your ideas. Because I think that whatever it is that calls us, well, maybe some of it was what called Harris as well, called him to the north. But there's this question: how north is north? How far did he have to go in order to get to this thing, to heed this call, to create this art, to uncover this landscape? Well, he began by exploring the Algoma region. In 1918, along with MacDonald and Johnston, he took his first trip to Algoma. Now, I love this painting. This is Algoma country. I think it's from about 1920. I was having a bit of a hard time finding the exact date on it. But you get a sense of how far he's come from the streets of Toronto here to this, wild space, to this place where not a house and not a person can be found. Here's another painting that he created. This one is at the McMichael Gallery in Kleinburg, Ontario. If you happen to be in the area, the McMichael is now open limited hours and with ticketing only, but they have a big celebration of the group of 7 right now. And if you have a chance, you can see this image live and in person along with other works by Harris. It's a stunning painting, and I like this version of it in this image. If you lean in just a little closer to your screen, you may notice you can see, the canvas coming through underneath and some of the brush strokes in it. Well, he went north, first to Algoma, and then, not finding exactly what he was looking for there, in 1921, he takes his first trip to the North Shore of Lake Superior. He went north, and now he was going to go norther. And while he was there, created, some of his most recognized work. This one, North Shore, Lake Superior from 1926, is quite iconic when it comes to Harris's work. It's iconic of his work, and I think also really representative of this Canadian landscape and this pull towards Canadian landscape. So he went north and then norther, and then, okay, so this picture that I showed you at the beginning, this is Harris leading the way, and behind him there is A.Y. Jackson. again, trying to heed to this call of the wild, trying to find this something he was looking for. Harrison Jackson in 1924, well, first they headed west. It was the first exploration to the west, and this is a painting he created from that called, well, it's untitled, but there are the mountains near Jasper, which he did sometime between 1934 and 1940. Yeah, he became actually quite captivated with the lakes and mountains in Alberta and then into BC as he caught his first glances of the Rockies. Okay, I can't begin to talk enough about this painting. And, thank goodness for great reproductions that let us see something of the blues and that pure white that he's capable of capturing, which is, one of the great skills of great painters is to paint pure white and pure black. Now notice the lines and the snow underneath and the rock formations. Notice the things that are changing as he goes north and norther, and in a minute norther, as this journey, as the wild calls to him, and he's full to exceeding more and more. I'll try again. As he's pulled towards more and more difficult places to reach, farther and farther from the suburban and the urban areas, literally into the wild. Yeah, he goes west and then again north. One of the things as he moves across the country, and one of the things as he moves farther and farther north to watch in his paintings is the evocation of light. And I wish we could all be looking at this live and in person now, because what he can do with light is remarkable. I mentioned earlier, we tend to know a lot about and relate things back to the European tradition. And I try to avoid it when I'm doing Canadian art, but I can't help it in this case. I think Harris does for light in Canada what Vermeer did for light in his time and in his place. Yeah, it's an amazing skill and ability he has. Yeah, it was to go farther and farther north. And eventually he would take a trip to the Arctic in Canada and capture images like this one from Davis Strait. Norther. He's on this journey. He's heeding this call. And well, just for a minute, take a look at what changed in his work along the way. First off, notice the way the palette has changed. Not only the subject matter, but the colors, entirely different. The cool whites and blues from those. And I have to say right now here in Ontario, we have these beautiful orange and yellow leaves on the streets all around actually where we live. So there's a big change and a shift here that you can see in place. But also notice is something's changing too in his style. From the kind of realism of the Richmond Street painting that you're looking at, I think it would be on your left, to the picture of the Rockies that we have on our right here. Notice, well, when you put them side by side, it's hard to believe that it's the same artist. He goes and changes his color scheme, but he also becomes increasingly abstract. Notice the starkness of the environment. Notice there's no little bits of shrubbery or no little bits of tree line. All those kinds of details that we have in the earlier paintings disappear, and we get a greater level of abstraction. The farther north that he went, the farther his career went on. And well, these mountains and these images captured something else, I think, for him as well. Here he is writing about what led him to and what preoccupied him. And he gives a bit of a cue or a clue, I think, as to what it was that pushed him or pulled him to these places. He wrote here that if we view a great mountain soaring into the sky, it may excite us, evoke an uplifted feeling within us. There is an interplay of something we see outside of us without inner response. The artist takes the response and its feelings and shapes it on the canvas with paint so that when it's finished, it contains the experience. Interesting what he's up to here, or what he's onto here. What he wants to do is capture more than just what the place looked like, but that something else, that exterior look, but also the interior response that we have. And this response that he's talking about, this inner landscape that he explored as he was looking at the exterior landscape, well, he linked it to something bigger than himself and bigger than the rocks themselves. Let me turn to him to help explain this. He thought that art was the beginning of vision into the realm of the eternal life. And if you noticed a little bit earlier, there was reference to a kind of universal response. I think especially in these late mountain paintings, that's what he's pointing us towards. He's pointing us towards the fact that there's something bigger encapsulated in this landscape, something bigger than who we are and what we are. And maybe part of the call of the wild for him was the fact that it kind of put us in proper proportion. You know, so easy for us on the streets where we live to think like we're something, to think we're bigger than what we are. Maybe part of the pull of the mountains was it put us in our proper perspective. We weren't bigger and no smaller than what we are. It was a matter of proportion, I suppose. And it also put us into this eternal life, that there are these rocks and these mountains have been here so much longer than us. We're at a minute, but a necessary and important minute as we stand here and we look at this place. Art is the beginning of a vision into the realm of an eternal life. Now, these ideas about the natural environment as we experience in the world, as we experience on the canvas, they were part of the air of the day. Harris was really well versed with American transcendentalism, the ideas that were expressed by people like Emerson and Thoreau, probably most beautifully captured in the poetry of Walt Whitman. What these philosophers and writers shared in common was the belief that nature was the expression of a spirit that was bigger and better than us, the expression of, well, for Emerson, of God, of the divine. We're going to imagine Emerson would have been more aware of the world of religions. And so I'm going to use the word divine as we move forward here. But yeah, that nature was the divine writing his, her, its story for us to perceive. And writing it not in words and paragraphs, not in books as it were, but writing it into the water, into the foliage, writing it literally into the mountains. And all we needed to do was to stop and to look, and we would have access to something bigger and something better than what we were. That idea was also something that was captured in Theosophy of Madame Blavatsky. Now, Madame Blavatsky developed the basic principles of Theosophy. Theosophy was really quite the rage during the time period that Harris was doing his greatest work, and he was a huge advocate. His break with Emily Carr came as a result of her unwillingness to embrace Theosophy in the fullness of its doctrine. What Theosophy tried to do was it tried to meld world religions, especially Eastern religions, with different kinds of spiritualism that were developing throughout America. At the time period, there's their symbol that says, right, there is no religion higher than truth. That's probably the best way to capture it. It was a mixture of world religions, as you can see, with all the different symbols of various religions encapsulated in this emblem of Theosophy and philosophy itself. It was trying to put the two together and find ways that they could better fit. Those ideas, I think, are behind the canvas. They're there informing Harris's paintings of the North and what's Norther and what's Norther. But I've spent time trying to figure out how those elements, shaped the journey that Harris went on. But what was it, that was calling to him? What was it that would lead him on this journey so far from the streets where he grew up on? Well, to better understand that, I think it's helpful to take a look, and I'm gonna philosopher for just a few minutes, but I promise I'll come back to the painting just for a few minutes. I think it's really helpful to turn to a work that was done in 1757 by Edmund Burke. It's called Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. And what Burke does in this essay is he tries to pull apart things that we tend to think of as synonymous. Oftentimes looking for a synonym for what's beautiful, people will say, oh, it's sublime. Burke would really disagree with that. He would say that the sublime is one thing, the beautiful something quite different. And looking at the trajectory of Harris's painting career, I think that that distinction is really helpful. Let me explain. Go back to this image, one of my favorite of Harris's paintings. This is his painting of Wellington Street. Now, this painting, using Burke's distinction, he would say this painting is beautiful. The beautiful for Burke, well, it derived from sort of social standards or social expectations of what beauty is, of what's admirable, of what's to be honored and to be admired. And he said that it's usually associated things that are delicate, which are small, which are detailed. He said there's a smoothness to it. I don't think that was just an idea about the object itself, but the image, there's a smoothness, perhaps better, a coherence to the things that we deem beautiful. He said beautiful things, well, they calm our nerves. I love that, but things that are beautiful, they calm our nerves. They are things that are comprehensible. They're things that we know. They're things, he would say, that we love. For him, those were the qualities and characteristics of the beautiful. And again, I think this painting by Harris is beautiful in that regard. The sublime, however, for Burke was something very different. The sublime, well, look at this image again, one of his paintings of the Rockies. The things that were sublime are not so easy. And I think that this is kind of key quality or characteristic that distinguishes the beautiful from the sublime. You see, things that are sublime have complicated emotions associated with them. You look at them and there's something beautiful, something soothing, but then there's something that isn't exactly. There's something a little maybe alienating about them. Oftentimes we speak of the sublime, we speak of it as something that's beautiful and terrifying and beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. It soothes you, but the minute that you feel like you're being soothed, you realize that there's something kind of scary that also lurks in the image. That's why I said the feelings we associate with the sublime are more complicated. They're not uniform the way the beautiful is. There are things, though, that, well, you look at them and you look at them and you know you are, I guess you know you are in the presence of something bigger than you. Looking at this painting, trying to figure out what Harris saw, what he was capturing about the exterior landscape and his interior landscape. I look and I look, and every time I look at it, I see something new and something different. It's as if it captures an idea that is bigger than my mind can think right now, bigger than my eyes can see, and requires me to be more open than my heart is in the moment. The sublime in that way is about things that constantly challenge us, things that overwhelm us, things that we can't put into neat and tidy kind of categories or packages for us. It's about those things that transcend boundaries. It captures something of what is incomprehensible to us. And as a result of that, the things that are sublime, they transform us, they change us somehow. You sit and you look and you look and you know that you're looking at something that captures more than you can think in the moment, but that you really want to learn more about and you wish you could hold on to. And well, I often tell a story of my one experience of the sublime, and when I knew it was something sublime, and I often say I didn't want my eyes to blink, and I didn't even want to breathe because I was afraid that I would somehow lose the magic of that moment. It would somehow be gone, and I wanted to hold on to it. But eventually you have to blink, and eventually you can't hold your breath that long. And when I did, I knew I had been in the presence of something that had changed me. I wasn't sure then just how or why, but I knew I had been changed or transformed. One way I think it gives us a chance to look at Harris's work, one entranceway into his work is to think of how his images kind of echo Burke's words, to think about what he's creating as a kind of Canadian sublime. He wrote that every work of art which really moves us is in some degree a revelation, that it changes us. And in and through those words, I think he echoes something of what Burke was talking about. Yet he could paint beautiful paintings, no question about it. But what called him to these places, to these wild spaces, was the search for something more than just the beautiful, the search for something that was sublime. He, again, kind of captures that idea that there's more than just the image that we see, the objects that we see, that we encounter in the wild, that they open up kind of an avenue to something bigger and greater than what we are. When he wrote this, he said, art isn't an amusement or a distraction, nor is it, as many men maintain, an escape from life. On the contrary, it is a high training of the soul, essential to the soul's growth, to its unfoldment. And I love that word, unfoldment. I think there's so much, if you think about when we go to wild places and wild spaces, in person, on the canvas, in our imaginations, how often do we find a kind of unfolding of ourselves, a discovery of something more essential, something greater? Well, all these ideas by Harris about the wild and all the things that pulled him to those places and spaces, he thought best were captured in this work. It was the painting he was most happy with. This is Isolation Peak. But this, done in the late 30s, was not the end of Harris's career. There's another part of Harris that's much less well known to the general populace, a whole other aspect, a whole other, well, decade of his work that gets lost. A lot of people don't know that Harris would actually, especially because he's this icon of Canadian art, that he actually left Canada for a period of time and went to the United States. He went first to New York City, and then he went off to New Mexico, and he began to create works that looked like this. Now, a couple of things about this. This is his mountain experience, 1936. First off, if we've looked at the works across kind of times chronologically of Harris's, you know that he's getting more and more and more abstract. In order to tell the truth of this other kind of experience he was having, in order to tell the truth of what he encountered when he was in the mountains, for example, well, in order to tell the truth, he had to tell the lie. The only way that he could capture that experience was in an abstract form. So a work like this one, this is his Mountain Experience, 1936, really makes that clear in both the title of the work, but also, excuse my cursor for a minute, you can see some of his mountain images clearly still within the painting. Yeah, this is one of the works he did while he was here in Santa Fe, and exploring different kind of elements or aspects of how do we capture that thing that calls us on the canvas? How do we capture this, the sublime, for the purpose of our discussion this afternoon, with lines and colors and composition? This is another work. This is by Kandinsky. During this time period that he's painting these while he's in the United States, Kandinsky and his kind of abstractions become really well known. And interestingly, he wrote a book called The Spiritual in Art. And so much of what Kandinsky writes and seems to be doing in his images seems to explain the trajectory in Harris's career as well, trying to capture this something more, this something else that drew him norther, that drew him to increasingly abstract images. There's something of the spiritual that gets connected with it. This was the painting I was actually looking for. This is called The Sun, the Earth, and the Earth from 1939, again from this later period, the abstract period in Harris's work. The literary critic, Northrop Frye, wrote this about these late abstract works of Harris. He said, in these abstract paintings, the rudiments of representation are still there, with the triangle and the circle replacing mountain and horizon. But the stylizing and simplifying of the outline have carried a step, perhaps one should say a dimension further. And interesting, that notion that there's a dimension further, that he went to the mountains to experience them, but also to encounter something else. He was heeding the call not only of the trees in the mountain, but of something perhaps bigger and perhaps better than what he was, that further dimension that Frye notices here. This is another one of Harris's abstract works, this one dating from 1938 to 1942. Probably a work he started while he was in America in 1940. He comes back to Canada. This is the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. Of this work, he wrote, the artist not only represents the forms visible and perceived of nature, but also becomes a privileged vessel containing and expressing nature's life and the divine spirit. Of all these late works, probably his greatest masterpiece is this one called Abstract Painting, number 119, sorry. That was completed in 1945 by him. Again, the mountains are there. You see some of the elements and the aspects of what was beautiful, to use a more traditional language, but then the pull, the abstraction that leads us to consider something more and something else. As I mentioned, perhaps something that's sublime. Look at this image and then put it beside the others, and I think you can see some of the resonances between the two. When I started off this afternoon, I mentioned that, you know, I couldn't think of a better companion to think about what calls us to wild spaces than Harris. Because number one, he gives us such an immense and such a beautiful collection of paintings to think through these issues and think of these issues with. And then we also have his writings, which help to elucidate, help to clarify, sorry, I don't know, this afternoon, help to clarify some of his ideas that he transcribed into lines and colors and compositions on this canvas. It is interesting to think about what more there is. What is it that the wild brings to us? What is it that we hope to find there? Is it the mountains? Is it the water? Is it the trees themselves? Or is there something else that they encapsulate? Is there something more that they embody that pulls us to these places? Yeah, there's a whole wide range of theories and ideas out there, everything from evolutionary psychologists talking about the kind of biological pull that we have to those places, to these kind of more spiritual conversations that Harris gets us to consider. Perhaps no place better than in this work. This is figures of with rays of light, and well, I couldn't think of a better painting to kind of encapsulate his, well, if not his theory of the sublime or of the spiritual that can be found, of the divine to be found in nature, at least his call for us to think more and think longer, perhaps harder, about what that call is, about what we hope to find as we enter the natural world. Now, these are some of the questions that really interest me. And when it is safe, someday, let's hope soon, I'm going to be looking at them actually in some of these places and in some of these spaces. With Worldwide Quest, Melanie mentioned at the beginning, I talk just really briefly about some of the trips we'll be taking. But Worldwide Quest, I'm headed off to Tofino in British Columbia, one of the most beautiful places on earth, to get us to think about our relationship to nature. We're calling the trip just that, in our nature. That's in May of 2021. In June, I'm going to move from the west across the country. In June, I'm in Ontario. I'll be going to Algonquin Provincial Park for a closer look at the places and spaces that Tom Thompson and the group of 7 became so captivated with. We'll be looking at the paintings and also spending time in that environment. That's June 13th to 19th, again, this coming year. And then finally, in September, we're going to go into the wild. We're going to head to the west coast of Newfoundland, to Grossmore National Park, which is close to, well, what you see here is Bond Bay. It is an extraordinary place. On the one hand, you have boreal forest, and on the other hand, you have one of the few places in the world where we experience mantle, where you actually have a space where nothing grows, it glows golden, and the earth's crust, the mantle itself, is exposed. We're going to be thinking more about these questions concerning the wild, actually in a wild place, in a wild space, and not just through the paintings and on the canvas. For those of you who are interested in these trips right now, Worldwide Quest, celebrating 50 years of travel, has a promotion going on. You can secure your spot in one of these trips or in one of the many other trips that they are planning for the year 2021, when the world opens up again and we're able to move from the canvas back to the world, taking, I think, though, lots that we've learned during our time in Dory and our time with these extraordinary artists and paintings, taking it with us back to wild places and wild spaces. Thank you so much for listening to this little talk about Lawren Harris and the call of the wild. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions.
Oops, I just realized my hair is totally sticking up in my headphones. That's okay. That's what I get for anyway. Thank you, Wendy. I really loved how you brought together these philosophical questions of the sublime and the beautiful, and definitely elucidating for me different theories about what makes them different. That was really cool. So as Wendy mentioned, we're going to take your questions, and I'm just going to get set up here with the questions. And while I do that, just a reminder to everybody, or just a note to everybody, a lot of the paintings that Wendy had mentioned are in the Art Gallery of Ontario, and so I think, and so some are in the McMichael, is that as well, right? Is that correct, Wendy?
Yeah, that's
So
correct. And both of those galleries are now opened at least for limited hours and with ticketing. If you have a chance to visit them. And I have to say, I've been missing paintings live and in person. And I'm heading off to the McMichael. It's a 100-year celebration of the Group of Seven that's going on there, a big exposition. And can't wait to be live and in person in front of paintings on the canvas if all goes well.
great. So let me get to the questions. Let's see. So, and this is a great question because it relates to what you were saying earlier, Wendy, about Lawren Harris in Santa Fe. So, Yana, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. So, some of Harris's work reminds me of Georgia O'Keeffe. Was he acquainted with her at all?
Yeah, he was actually. And if you saw, that was Taos, that photograph I had of him in New Mexico. Yeah, and they did. And there was an exchange. He knew her. Also, Emily Carr and Georgia O'Keeffe were aware of each other's work. So if you see elements that resonate, especially with Georgia O'Keeffe's abstractions, we get so used to her flowers and bones and flowers. Sometimes her abstract work, her really more abstract work, get lost. And you know what? You're absolutely correct to see these resonance between them. The other thing to say is, it was very much the product of the time. This, how could you capture what more you found in nature on the canvas? The outlines and the contours, the realism of somebody like Audubon, for someone like Harris, and I think also for O'Keeffe, allowed you to capture the way it looked on the outside, but not the way it felt on the inside, or it allowed you to capture what was right there in front of you. But this other element that I think both O'Keeffe and Harris saw in the work, you couldn't do that in a kind of realistic form. And so they're moved towards abstraction. So you're dead on. There's a really clear connection between the two.
Thank you, Wendy. Another question that deals with the relationship between Harris and other artists. Jane and others are just remarking on the just the dramatic way in which his paintings changed over time. And she asks, do you think other Group of Seven members also changed as dramatically?
So I'm going to pull up that screen if I can find it, where I have the two side by side. I can't find it. I apologize, but we can go back and forth. Yeah, when you take a look at this is where he came from, and this is the sort of stuff, and well, actually, this is the sort of stuff he would end up painting. Yeah, what a huge trajectory, right? From the detailed, kind of realistic, maybe a little bit expressionistic works of the streets of Toronto to these kind of abstract images. He was always, experimenting with form and color, always experimenting with the composition of his works. So I usually hesitate to criticize other artists, and maybe it's not a criticism. I'm going to pretend it isn't. But I don't think any of the other Group of Seven artists had that same kind of experimental spirit in them to take up these different kinds of modes, to try different sorts of things. Maybe Varley would be the exception. Varley did do abstractions. Along with doing landscapes, Varley also did a number of portraits. So he was experimenting in theme and style as well, but you're dead on, Jane, when you talk about just the expanse of his work. And like I said, this constant attempt to try to experiment, to capture this something. That's my technical term for it, because I don't know a good word for what it was that he was experiencing in the wild that he wanted to get on his canvas. But whatever it was, the constant need to try new forms and new ways was guiding him the whole time. So yeah, he was the great experimenter of that particular group, I think.
Thank you, Wendy. And kind of on a follow-up note, just some contributions from different people answering your question, what draws you to the wild? So Beverly says, I live in rural Ontario, but I love the North with a passion. And she describes growing up on her family's farm in Norfolk County. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is in southwestern Ontario on the north shore of Lake Erie. And she talks about her dad spending time on this farm. But she said, I always wanted to know about the area where my father used to go hunting. It was his stories that made me want to explore this area that I found fascinating. My dad's influence sparked my curiosity of the North. And she says, I was hooked on that love of the North. I've never lost that love. And I love exploring Algonquin and see why the group of 7 loved this area. She also now paints this area and says, it fills my soul with excitement and fascination. That is why I am drawn to the wild.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Beverly. And I think a lot of us.
This is Betty, sorry.
Thank you, sorry. And you know what, I think I was reading a book on winter. And I know many of you are going, no, it can't happen. Why are you doing that? It'll happen soon enough. But
Wendy loves winter, I know.
I do love winter. I love snow. I know, which makes me kind of weird to many people, but I was just reading Adam Gottlieb's, his Massey lectures on winter. And one of the things that he writes about there is, you know, the pull of the sort of, the call of the, you know, let me try to explain, you know, that romantic idea of a place that's left open, of a place yet to be explored. I keep thinking about Manifest Destiny, you know, in the United States, that pull west. Well, in Canada, we didn't get the pull west, we got the pull north. And, you know, this is our sort of romantic space and place. There's something about maybe the white, maybe it's the desolate nature of it. I think it's totally magical and it sparkles. But there's something that pulls us there. So I'm with you. And thank you for that comment. Something about the magic of the North.
And just a couple more comments about the relationship between the wild and beauty. Karen says, I think society dangles beauty in the hopes that this will satisfy us in exploring what is beyond us. Art gives us permission to go beyond society, and in Canada, to look beyond beauty and explore the sublime.
Oh, thank you for that. And notice the resonance with what Burke is writing in 1797. That he already recognized that, you know, what's beautiful is socially, what we would say now is socially constructed. You know, he calls it the standards of society being transformed in us. And so it kind of placates us in a certain way. Whereas the sublime is this daring sort of thing. It's outside of and can't be constructed, which I also find really interesting. I was speaking to a curator one time, and we were talking about possible new exhibitions that she was kind of thinking her way through. And she said, oh yeah, maybe something on the notion of the sublime. And I sort of stopped her in the way sometimes geeky philosophers do and said, no, but you can't construct a sublime environment. You can't say, oh, this painting is sublime, because in saying this painting is sublime, you take away the conditions for the possibility of it actually being sublime. You know, you're telling somebody, look at this, it's deep. And in some ways that takes away anything that you can discover on your own and for your own, which is another element of the sublime. The sublime is not socially constructed, but something that each one of us can only experience for him or herself. And I was thinking, I mentioned the literature on the wild that's just, you know, multiplying exponentially at the moment. And how much of what I've been reading of late has been about individuals going out and exploring different wild spaces and wild places. And there's something of that sense or sensibility of Burke, I think, still in there. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Wendy. One more comment, and then I have a few questions before we wrap up. So this is from Beverly, in answer to your question about going to the wild. We go because this is where we belong. Where we essentially come from. are as life intrinsic to, a returning. It's an opportunity to explore the awe of which we are a part. And Beverly, I think, just to clarify, do you mean a part like a part of, or a part as in separate from? Because you could just clarify there. I wasn't sure from the way it was phrased. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Oh, but can I just quickly say, there's a whole thesis called that you may know of, that's looking at literally what you're saying, that we belong in and of nature. It's where we came from, and we feel at home there in a way that in the built world and the built environment we never can. And I was mentioning again the literature that's coming out on the natural environment and much on our effect on it, but also its effect on us. And there's a work called the Nature Fix, for example, that very much picks up on this idea and talks about literally what changes in us, not just in terms of our ideas or our emotions, but the physiological changes that occur to us. And I find that so interesting, right? Like that take us back to nature. And I was thinking, you know, our longing to be in nature, or people who are out on nature trails and on doing walks every day while we have to social isolate. There's something to that. And, you know, every public health official says, you know, make sure you get out for a walk for at least 20 minutes a day. And they're looking at the health advantages of that. And, you know, it's a little echo of something bigger. Also loved, by the way, Beverly, I think I have the name right this time. I love that reference to the notion of awe. And, you know, when I mentioned earlier that we get put into proportion, not bigger than and not smaller than what we are, but we're somehow in proportion when we're in the wild. I think it's that notion of awe that we then can have. I guess what I mean by that is, you know, when we start to think of ourselves as being bigger than what we are or being less than what we are, we in some ways take away the conditions for the possibility of an experience of awe. And it was maybe more on that on another day. I think awe and wonder, some of you know I have a project called the Wonder Project, where I've been very fascinated in, you know, our experiences of wonder and what allows us to have them and what's happened in society and in us that makes those harder and harder. And so I really appreciate your comment, Beverly.
Thanks, Wendy. Just two more questions. It's kind of a practical question from Yena.
Yeah.
Did Lawren paint in the wild, or did he do drawings in the wild and then paint later in the studio?
He did both. He did drawings while he was painting, you know, en plein air when he was in place, when he was in the wild, but also did a number of small studies that would then be transferred into bigger works and when he got back to the studio. That was like, well, each of the group of 7 had a very different style and palette and idea about abstraction and all those sorts of issues. The one thing that they did was they all went to the place. They did at least drawings, if not, you know, small studies that then they would go back and work up into finished canvases. A little bit of a plug for the Art Gallery of Ontario. We have a number of, for example, Tom Thompson's small studies that you can see, and then see the completed works that are on display there. And well worth spending time looking at the studies to think that, you know, he was in the middle of nowhere and created them are fascinating. Less of those in that collection of Lawren Harris, but you get a sense of it by looking at these works, both individually, but also in relation to each other, what that must have been like.
Thanks, Wendy. And one last question from Nella, another of our longtime leaders. So Nella says, yeah, hi Nella. Nella says there was a suggestion of a Madonna figure in one of the later paintings in blue with pale light. I think this is the figures. Nella, let us know if this is the one. And she asks, did Harris ever comment on gendered metaphors of the divine or of the spirit? Gaia, for example.
Not that I know. I don't know that he wrote on or talked about it, but we have to go again to Theosophy, and I whole afternoon on the influence of Theosophy on both the intellectual work and also the artistic work of this time period, because it was so influential and so many people were drawn towards it. In some of the Eastern traditions, as you mentioned, the notion of Gaia, and if you looked back at that symbol for Theosophy that shows all the different religions that it tried to encompass and find truth in and through, I think you hear echoes of that. But Nella, you know what? I can't think of any place where he addressed gender in that regard directly. Other things, you know, about women painters, he did, but in terms of relationships to the divine, I'm afraid I haven't run across it. Sorry about that. But you're right. Many people have said it looks like a Virgin Mary in the middle of this. Not sure if he was what he knew about the Catholic Church exactly, but yeah, there's something divine in the middle there, and again, it's all about the evocation of light.
Thanks. And one more question popped up. So Wendy, if you will just give a quick answer to this one. This is from Jennifer asking if you could elaborate on whether Harris and others in the group of 7 thought about ecology and preserving the earth in their time. Of course, a major preoccupation for us today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think they were all really well aware, spending time especially up in what's now Wellington Park, it was then too, sorry. They were aware of clear cutting for sure. In the works of Emily Carr, you see what she called screamers, which are the cut trees. They were well aware about the influence we were having on the environment, and I think it was part of their project to protect it. Though I don't think they could have imagined that it would lead us to where we are today, to some of the heart-wrenching images we have today. To that effect, very interesting to put side by side some of the images that we've seen from the group of 7, whether Tom Thompson or Lawren Harris or one of the other groups, with the work of another Canadian artist, which is Edward Brzezinski. He did a film and an art collection called The Anthropocene. And he goes back, in fact, to some of these exact places to look at what centuries of human intervention have done. And yeah, I can't recommend more looking at some of the group of 7's work and then looking at Brzezinski's images and thinking about the trajectory between the two. So yeah, for sure they were aware. I think there was an early inkling towards what might happen and their desire to protect the environment. Sometimes, you know, more muted, and sometimes Carr, for example, more directly. But again, to see where we've been from where we came from is both shocking and I think an also important way to have a call to protect these wild spaces and places.
Thanks, Wendy, and I'll include that link that you mentioned in the follow-up email. Just a reminder to everyone, we always do send a follow-up with a recording of the webinar and some resources for further reading. And I'll pass on to Wendy. So I know some of you commented more extensively on your relationship to the wild, and we'll make sure that Wendy sees all of those. So that is it for our webinar today. Thank you so much, Wendy. So inspiring as always, and refreshing but invigorating. It's always a treat to spend this Thursday with you. A practical reminder to everybody. People were asking about our webinar time. So the Classical Pursuits webinars are always at 2 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, usually on Thursdays. Today we're on Wednesday. Tomorrow we're back with Sean, so I hope you talking about Japanese art. I hope you join us then. The following Thursday, Wendy and I are going to be talking about women in the Parisian Cafe, and then the week after we do have that special Wednesday Remembrance Day webinar about all of these at 2 Eastern. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, everyone.
And look forward to see everyone tomorrow.
Take good care and stay safe. Thank you again.
Bye-bye, everyone.